The impact of oil drilling on Guyana's environment and coastal livelihoods. It's quite an honor to be standing next to this lady here. The reason is because I have known her name for more than 20 years now. And she has been writing consistently on forestry issues and what happens if we cut down the forests and so on. And that's what, it's quite an honor to be standing next to her now and for her to be talking, educating us on this topic. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. The honor is mine. Mike just dated me, as Janice would say, I'm a very ageable person. So I have 25 minutes and I'm going to do a quick gallop through my slides. So there are 8 points there. Can you please change it? Firstly, I'll talk about the Guyana's exclusive economic zone, because that's where the state holds sovereignty. And so what happens there is an extension of the sovereignty of that happens on land, or the governance on land. I'll talk about the economic and cultural relationships with the sea. Then about the lack of marine planning, no one marine spatial authority. And then quickly talk about Exxon's, the scope of Exxon's activities in the EEZ, knowing that Vince, who comes after me, will do more of that. Then really to my meat of my topic, which is artisanal fisheries in Guyana. What we see from the pattern, what the data we have on artisanal fisheries, the way fisheries and fishers are being treated as collateral damage, and finally what fishers themselves want. So here are some takeaway points. There's 3 of them. One is that the activities of Exxon, and as Chris Ram just said, the subcontractors and all the others, are some of the factors in this decline in the fish catch, which is reported a lot in Guyana. I think of an important point is what, again, I think the presenters here have mentioned, and which we read about, which is we see this free rein given to by the government of Guyana to the contract, to the 2016 contract with ExxonMobil, which has been allowed to override the pre-existing rights of fishers, people who have rights both legal and customary. And finally, I think another key point to make is that fishers themselves, they want to be part of a discussion. They would like to have associations and to have a voice. They do not want to be just getting handouts and hampers. And so this is a real call for governance that we see from fishers themselves. So quickly, here is a little bit of a map of the coast of Guyana, a bit of a chart. And what I don't know, I can't point it to you, but in the upper left-hand corner, that's where ExxonMobil's platforms are. And so it's, as you can see from the coastline, which is the yellow part, it's quite a distance out. So the fishers who operate are more close to the coast, 1 fathom, 2 fathoms. They're going out as far as generally 18 to 19 fathoms. But they're, as Exxon says, we're 190 kilometers offshore. This fisheries, we're not affecting it because it's inshore. The area of the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone, is about 64% of our land area. So as Guyanese, whether we live in Guyana or abroad, we ought to be concerned about what goes on in our name in that area. Something that Chris Ram stressed as well. So I'll talk a bit about the relationships we have with the sea, with this 64% of land area. And for coastlanders, very often, when you read about ExxonMobil, you read about oil, it's as if there's no cost to it. But there are costs. There are economic costs, which Taran talked about, Chris talked about, Vince will talk about other costs. But there are environmental costs as well, and we see those. We can't assume it's a free good. And that because this oil is coming from 190 miles away, we're not seeing it actually, 190 kilometers, as though it's a free good. It's not. I've just put a photograph there of some baby shark, which are sold freely in the markets. that's another cost. We also have to bear responsibility. If we are freely allowing small sharks to be caught and sold, those can't grow up to be grown sharks with eggs to feed the next generation. So they're all costs. What we'll see in terms of relationships with the sea, if you stand on the seawall or anywhere along our coast, you will see fish pens like these. And these are ways in which in the mouths of the rivers, particularly in the estuaries, fishers will place their nets here, and fish, depending on the tides, will flow into these fish pens. And that's part of the culture we share. Next slide. Next slide, please. So, as well, culturally, these are photographs of Hindu deities which are picked up along the seashore by the bandstand in Georgetown by a friend of mine who cleans the seawalls, who does the trash that Guyanese leaves. And these flow back onto the shore, and they're placed there as offerings by Hindus who are making offerings to Ganga Mai. When we came from India, our forefathers came from India 150 years ago, they brought with them the reverence for Mother Ganges. And that's the sea. And part of what, in terms of governance for the sea, is if we re-engage with Ganga Mai, we may then begin to think about how do we govern this space? How do we revere and protect this space, not just as is demonstrated by the offerings to Ganga Mai. Yeah, and that's just, of course, a little temple in the kinds of homes we see and I see it with the homes of fisher people in Georgetown. Again, part of this reverence. So the coast of Guyana is one which many Guyanese find very hard to love. They see mud, mangroves, mosquitoes. And this is completely different to the sun, the beaches of the Caribbean, for example. And this means that it's hard to then make it welcoming to tourists. There's the mud here. And so the stretch along the coast of Guyana is where people very often, some kids will go to swim, but very often Guyanese are not going there to think about it. The trash goes there, and it's seen as almost no man's land. Here are some photographs of mangroves along the river again, making it difficult to have direct access to rivers and seas. Here's a photograph of what this fishermen call jack. When they say jack is affecting their fishing, it's this very rough sea that's caused by what's called a fair wind from the north, again seen as inhospitable. So this is the sea which we need to think about as Guyanese. How do we govern it? And we need for that an integrated marine spatial plan. If there's no integrated plan, next one, then the strongest people, in this case the petroleum companies, they will enforce and they will dictate the terms of engagement. So the coast is vulnerable, we know that. Here's a photograph of a coker that's way out into the sea because of sea level rise that's, covering the land. So Guyanese are aware we need to be thinking about this low coastal plain and sea level rise. And so we need planning. But there's just an absence, and fishermen particularly talk about this, not being known who has authority over what in this space. So the Constitution, Chris Ram, who just spoke, is part of a group called Article 13, and their focus is on shared governance. Article 36 talks about the need, these are clauses which talk about the need for protecting for each Guyanese intact environment. Article 13 what talks about shared governance and giving citizens a say in how the Guyana is administered. Well, here's a picture of the Attorney General who in April this year said, oh, those are just aspirational clause. That's not justiciable. And so for that to change, for us to feel engaged, requires citizens to act. There's no shortage of laws to to govern the space. And here there's a list, for example, of how much legislation there is. And many agencies, the problem with these agencies is that they have overlapping functions and great rules on paper, not administered in practice. And I've highlighted in green the ones which deal with the sea. So no functional integrated marine spatial plan. Coordination is on an ad hoc basis. I see that particularly when I speak to fishermen who are explaining the difficulties they face, trying to figure out who to talk to when they're pirates, stealing, shakedowns, and so on. No coastal zone management authority, and particularly because a great deal of our fishing takes place by Guyanese fishermen in Surinamese sovereign waters. They know, they have a frame of reference for contrasting what happens in Suriname versus the non-action in Guyana. So it isn't, they know Suriname, French Guyana, there's routine policing, routine patrolling, none of this. In Guyana, what we have is very centralized decision-making at the very apex of power of the executive. So let's talk a little bit about Exxon and what affects these fishermen who are close inshore. So fishermen, if you look at the newspapers, or you Google fishers, Guyana, there you'll see this word vibrations. That's what they say. Exxon vibrating the water, and that's why we're not getting fish. They're also concerned about noise, chemical discharges, and spills, of course, which I think Vince will talk about, from these oil field supply vehicles, which are going up and down this 190 kilometers offshore back to, from offshore inland. So when the oil goes north for refining, what do we get in Guyana? We get the waste. We get radioactive waste and any manner of waste, and a lot of it is also put right back into our sea. There are at least 26 of these oil field supply vessels which are running offshore every day. And the fishermen see this. Next slide. So there are ecological impacts. This is not a free, oil is not just coming for free. It disrupts the migration routes of the fish, the shrimp, the large marine mammals as well. And there's, as I mentioned, waste which are coming on shore and being deposited in communities and in Hagsbosch, which is already overwhelmed by the level of waste that's being trucked into Guyana every day. So what are these fishermen seeing? Well, what they see are the geophysical and geotechnical surveys from these estuaries, going the length of the EEZ. They're seeing they're aware of the sub-bottom profiling which is disturbing the seabed. They know that there are surveys for fiber optic cables. More and more companies are coming here and want to have great internet. There's a trenching of the sea bottom for all these cables, the installation of what are called surfs, and some clearing of mangroves. Fishers are the ones who see this. Us coastlanders, we don't see that. And so they're seeing as well, or they're aware that there's this dumping, or they're reading about it. I am reading about it. The dumping of cubic kilometers, huge amounts of produced water which is contaminated with oil. Vince will talk about that. Cooling water which is heated much higher than the level, than the ambient temperature of the sea. A flaring of gas. All of the environmental permits say the gas must be re-injected, but it's been consistently flared, and a dumping overboard of waste. That's all. You might say, okay, there's one platform, but we're now up to the 5th oil platform, and of over 160 wells in planning. Here's a photograph of the kind of seismic vessels which operate offshore in our EEZ. So these are ships which have been operating since 2013, and they're carrying along the side, sort of off the back, rays of guns, which are shooting, next slide please. So these are air guns are shooting bubbles of pressurized air into the water. And they're trying to get a sense of what's underneath the seabed. And the sound underwater is hitting the fish. what's the word I'm looking for?
Marine life.
The marine life. And so this is affecting them. Even though it's 190 miles away, it's an indivisible sea. This sound can be as loud as 260 underwater decibels. So the swim bladders, that's what I was looking for. The swim bladders of fish, even crustaceans, are affected. And these ships are going methodically back and forth, 24/7. Them man don't sleep, the fishermen will tell you. And it's been going on since 2013. So we would be naive to think that there's no impact on marine life, sea life in our ocean. Drilling of wells, again, I think Vince will talk about this. 1 mile is 1,500 meters. They are going through a mile of water, and then more than 2 miles into the the surface of the earth to get this deep, the petroleum which is being extracted. So maybe it's far away, 190 kilometers, but the vibrations that the fishermen say is maybe part of that. Certainly the swim bladders of fish are probably aware of this. Drilling of wells, I'm going to, because I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to go a bit far quicker and talk about the artisanal fishers, which are the small-scale fishers of Guyana. So these are important for our food security, socially, culturally, and 1/10 of the Guyanese population and their families depend on fishing. This is not a small number of people. I mean, for many Guyanese, we're only aware of fish. I certainly was when I see it on my plate. But there's a huge population for which artisanal fisheries are important livelihood. So 90% of the Guyanese population lives on the coast. The global consumption of fish is 17 kilos a year. In Guyana, according to the FAO, it used to be 40 kilos a year in 2003. That's progressively declined. And I think part of the reason is because fish is very expensive. Fish is now more expensive in Guyana than chicken. And a lot of it is, part of the reason is it's the exporters who send it to markets in Ozone Park, where I am here, and to Toronto, for which they get higher prices. So fishers have rights. They have legal rights and they have customary rights. And you can't see this photograph very well, but this is the estuary of the Berbice. And this is part of the UK Hydrographic Office chart. And on these charts of the coast, it's very clear in blue areas where they say entry prohibited fishing stakes. So the fish pens I showed you in the first photographs, this is marked on all of the official maps which are used by MARAD, and it says in blue, entry prohibited fishing stakes. That's recognized on our official maps. Fishers are paying for a range of license every year. And when I speak to fisher people, they are part of fishing families that go back generations. My great-grandfather. The words used in fishing in Guyana are words which are no longer used in India. They are archaic Hindi words. And this is a kind of our cultural heritage that we need to respect and not throw away lightly. So these fishers are paying for a license, boat registration license, what I call jackman. You're a workman, you're a jackman, their license, and these have been paid annually for generations. These are important rights which are held as equal in importance as the right which Exxon has in its 2016 contract. So how many jackmen are there? These are the the most invisible of the fishers. Probably over 5,000. We think about it. Since 1999, for which I could find figures, there are about 1,300 artisanal boats. Multiply those 1,300 or 1,000 by 4 by the captain and 3 crew. That's 1,000 by 4. You would get 4,000. Add their families. You see the kinds of numbers of people who are directly dependent for livelihoods. A hamper isn't going to cut it. If we destroy that, that's not going to feed them annually. Many have had childhoods of real poverty, great abuse. Rum drinking is the scourge of Guyana. They come out, they tell you these stories and you realize what sufferings they went through. They have no functioning self-governing associations. And I don't have time to talk about the business proposition, but it's one where they're treated as shareholders in the catch. When the catch is fine, they get a share. When the catch is not fine, they go home with nothing. There's no written contracts, there's no unemployment insurance. This is people whose livelihoods are made even more precarious in the time of oil. So what the Red Women was speaking about is what fishers are experiencing. A huge rise in cost of living with no cushions for them. And we'll go quickly, so this is just some headlines from the newspapers, which show the declining shrimp production. Next slide. Taking licks at sea. Next slide. What the fishers are saying, look, we've had a real decline in every bangameri, which is the sort of the boats that go up to 8 or 10 fathoms, and then further out, sea trout, snapper, and so on. But this decline is also shown from the Bank of Guyana figures, which I'll show you a quick slide of, and also links to when you can see quite a sharp decline from 2019 when ExxonMobil began oil production. So let's just look at the available fisheries data. This is not very good. The data is quite suspect, but here the slide begins 1983. So much before ExxonMobil, and you can see here, this is a prawns production, that it's one trajectory downwards. Next slide. Here is the landed fish catch. This is from 2003 again. This is, these figures are from, this one is from FAO, and you can see this slide Bank of Guyana reports. All species, all locations. Again, you can see quite sharply from 2019, or maybe you can't see, the even sharper, but the trajectory is one of downward decline. Next slide. So these are fishers at Lily and Dahl, and their boats are parked up. And now they say as well, with the extension of the Demerara ship channel, willy-nilly that mud which is just being spewed is making their area even harder to access. They can only wait until the tide is high. Fishers also talk about climate change. So while they say it's easy to think of ExxonMobil as maybe a big, vast and popular and wealthy entity that they can get some kind of compensation from, they also live in the sea. They're going there all the time. And so they're saying the kinds of things which scientists explain differently. That there's more rainfall. Anyone who's been in Guyana would know that June rains have gone right into August, only now drying up. More discharges of colder water from the rivers. There are 9 major rivers which are flowing from the interior to the coast of Guyana. These rivers are bringing more colder water and pushing the bangameri, the trout, and the snapper further offshore. So fishers are actually going further and further away. And because they're going further away, they're spending more, and their costs are higher. But we see the same fish in the market, so people are not as aware of the decline. Fishers also will realize that there are too many boats out there. As I mentioned, the figure since 1999, this figure of 1,300, 1,000 to 1,300 artisanal boats is in every report you can find. Maybe it's more or less, we can't tell, but the gear becomes more and more sophisticated. Each fisher from a bangameri boat will have at least a mile of nets. Trout and snapper, 2-3 miles of nets. So you can imagine the entire coast with nets means that the stock of fish are probably dwindling. And so fishers will tell you, we need government to hold the line. We can't do this by ourselves. We need government to help us to have rules and regulations. At the moment, it's just open access. So finally, what do we see? That ExxonMobil commissioned its consultancy company, ERM, to do a study of fishing. But in that, there's no information on stocks of any kind of fish or population, sizes, species, ages, nothing about the areas in which these fish are feeding, where they're spawning or migrations. this is standard in all other fishing reports commissioned by companies which have to be operating in the same area as fishermen. But even though the EP Act of 1996, the Environmental Protection Act, requires whole project assessment, this was not done. So Simon Mangal in particular this is a Guyanese environmentalist who has been insisting on this point. The work done has been substandard and does not allow us therefore to protect, to know which are the spawning areas which need to be protected, and how can we then have a coexistence of fishing and oil in the same exclusive economic zone. I just want to mention this quickly. A Dutch company, Cool, was given 787 million Guyana dollars to remove 3 wrecks. That's almost $4 million US. These wrecks were in the Demerara Ship Channel. Fishers have their pens on either side, right up against there. Plus, they're traversing this area. This company got $4 million US to move 3 wrecks. The fishers will explain to you that these wrecks also serve. They didn't know the word FAD is fish accumulating devices, because the fish go and they find refuge in these wrecks, and that's where they spawn. But when these things were being moved and fishes are being chased out, nobody's paying them compensation, nobody consulted them, because they're seen as invisible or without rights in that space. Mention that. So they've had no compensation for their torn nets. All of this movement that I detailed in the beginning is going along the Guyana coast for subsea drilling and surfs on areas where fishers were and where their nets are. Their nets are have been torn up, and they say they got a man with a megaphone telling us, get out, get out, get out. Notices are posted in the newspaper by Marad. Fishers are illiterate. Of all of you I spoke to, they left school at 7 years old, 11 years old. Nobody went to high school. So they're not reading, they can't afford to buy newspapers. So Marad notices put in newspapers are meaningless to them. But they have rights. As I say here, government holds the reins of power, and they should be compensated. So similarly, when sugar was nationalized and bauxite and compensation was paid, fishers need just and equitable compensation, because they had prior rights, generational rights, and customary rights. And they feed us. They feed us. And that should be as important or more important than a few barrels of oil going north and fueling the inflation, the runaway inflation that Taran talked about. So this is the most recent thing. This is a kind of spewing of mud by this dredging of the Demerara Ship Channel. I think we are paying for it. I asked someone, who's paying for this ship called the Zhenghu to be out there extending and deepening the channel? And nobody answered. I think it's us, the Guyanese taxpayers. But it's creating what they call mud walls. Fishers tell me, we said them mud walls can be bigger than the seawalls. Their boats are getting stuck there. And that's because nobody has ever asked them, where should this mud be spewed? Next slide. So here's another picture of the chart. The area in blue, but you can't see, it says, entry prohibited fishing stakes. This is our coast. This is the Demerara, the straight line out, that's the main ship channel. Fishers operate in these areas, but there's no authority which allows them to form associations through whom they could negotiate. So I don't have time, and I don't want to extend my time. I'm not going to talk about the piracy which they face and for which they have had, very little understanding of how to have beyond rough justice here. So I'm going to skip all of these slides quickly and come to the next one. What fishers want. So what fishers want is they know that in Suriname there's more government regulation. They think, why can't Guyana have that? Why are we lesser? We are more population-wise, and all Suriname are Guyanese. They would like structured discussions. They would like an end to stopgap measures, and they want to have fishers and the sea to become sustainable. The budget for, I think it's this year, it's over 700 million Guyana dollars for fisheries, of which over 500 million are going to prawns. What do you call those things? Fish pens to make shrimp on land. That's just going for private property. Those are some rich people who are friends with someone, and they're getting all their areas dug out, and that's not benefiting the fish on which Guyanese depend. That's completely public subsidy of for private benefits. So they don't want to be treated as collateral damage, and I think it's my last slide. We don't want a new road. This was a thing. Putting money into roads, as Tara talked about, that's not going to feed us. Next slide. What fishers want, a future for their children that goes beyond hand to mouth. They want their stories to be part of the education that we hear in schools. They are sentinels of the ocean. They tell us what's going on. They should be part of a reporting scheme. They would like to be part because they have immense skills, part of the monitoring and evaluation. They could be tour guides, the way we have interior populations, interior citizens who are tour guides. They can take tours out. They can be trained to do that. So finally, we have to ask, oil will be done. In another 40 years, Exxon will pack up and go away. They'll live in their clean places. What will be its legacy for us? Will we have a polluted and degraded Atlantic? Or will we just have these mud banks? Will we destroy fishermen and the knowledge they brought from India 150 years ago, that language they used? And some of the words they use, I think, what does that mean? And I realize it's an old Hindi word. Are we going to throw that away for what? For ExxonMobil's benefit? We should think twice about that. So, yes, some of the factors are petroleum related. Some, of course, is climate change. Some, of course, is these greater flushes of fresh water. Some of it is the pollution that we as Guyanese, everything goes trash into the ocean, and it's also overfishing. There's a concatenation of reasons for which you need government policy to begin to figure out how to address them. And I wanted to, there are things which are being done, which can elsewhere. The industrial seabob fishery has a closed season of 6 weeks every year. We could have a closed season of all fisheries when small fish are spawning. We now have oil money. Let's compensate the fishers who will put away their boats. Let's take some of those boats out. Let's compensate people. That's what you do if you have a plan. We should remove. So fishers, I tell you, Suriname, we can't use nets under 3 inches in mesh diameter. In Guyana, it's complete lawlessness. Why? We should have more self-respect. And finally, this is my absolute last slide. What can people in the diaspora do? Persons like us who are sitting here. Well, if you know, you come from a village, or you know people in Guyana, you have WhatsApp groups, you can begin to figure out who are the fishers whom you can reach. I think you can help them. You can have them to do a course in health and safety, courses like that, to do emergency aid, get the equipment for their boats so that they can have proper life jackets. When you go, you encourage people, take a tour, pay $100 US, go along the seashore, learn the fishermen, they have amazing knowledge. They know 500 species of fish. They can tell you about them. Have a tour, help to build livelihoods. Alternative livelihoods as tour guides for fishers, help to be part of the governance. If you start in a small way, with a few people, a few associations, it will have a ripple effect. The fishing that's going on now is probably unsustainable, but we can't wait for government to act. I think Guyanese in the diaspora can reach through their networks, help fishers, help them to be trained, their kids, wear a nice little uniform, have a plasticated ID card, take a tour. Of course, you don't want to send people unless the boat is seaworthy. But you can do that. The companies in Georgetown will help to train them, even for illiterate fishers. And let us build that governance and love together. Thank you.